Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Stoughton Delicatessen Restaurant. I'm Aaron Rand, along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette, Lesley Chesterman, and our guest today, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, co-leader of Quebec Solidaire. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So we always ask guests when they first show up, is this your first time at the
It is my first time. I'm a little bit ashamed of that fact, but it is my first time. But I won't leave without a smoked meat sandwich.
Yeah, well, every guest gets a smoked meat sandwich.
It's
an honorarium.
Right. That's how we get people to come.
That's right. That's all it takes.
Not for us, yeah.
All right, let's
idea.
talk about a couple of things. There's a lot of news in the
Yeah.
past couple of weeks.
Yep.
I want to start with one, which happens to be the surging popularity of the Parti Québécois. And I thought to myself, it's not that long ago we talked about the death of the PQ, only a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden, here they come we had Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon here a week ago. You've been holding steady at around 16% for quite a while now. But now I've heard people saying, Quebec Solidaire, they're pretty much done as a political party. So first of all, your reaction to that, and second of all, why you don't think you're managing to gain any traction with voters?
It's not the first time that Quebec Solidaire has challenged, and it's not the first time that people are doing bad prophecies about us. You know, a few years ago it was Quebec Solidaire will never elect one member of parliament. Then Amir Kadir was elected. After that it was, Quebec Solidaire is never going to be able to elect a second. And then a third member of parliament. Then Françoise and Manon Massé came along. And until a few years ago, the popular saying was Quebec Solidaire will never get any elected official outside Montreal. Yet in 2018 and at the last election, we have a good proportion of our caucus that is from outside of Montreal. I do not say that to say that there's no challenge for us, that we don't need to work better and harder to expand our electorate. But we are used to having the odds against us, and the history of our party in the last 15 years, I think, has been an history of resilience, where each time we succeed in overcoming those odds and going to the next level. So we have a challenge in the next years. We know that we have that challenge, but I am confident we will rebound.
Well, how is it, though, that you have not been able to pick up on all the support that M. Legault has lost and M. Plamondon has picked up on? I mean, politically speaking, of course, you're a little more left, but you have a lot in common. You're both young, dynamic leaders. How is it that when Mr. Legault makes a gaffe, it's the PQ that picks up at it and not you guys?
The politics is full of mysteries. If I would know how to solve all of those mysteries, I would be a very rich guy, or maybe first in the polls. But that's not the question I ask myself in the morning. When I wake up, when I walk to Parliament, the question I ask myself is not how do I pick up points in the poll. The question I ask myself is what needs to be done in Quebec. And I'm going to give you an example. We've been talking at Quebec Solidaire of the housing crisis for years and years and years. We've been talking about this before it was the talk of the town inside the mediatic and the political class. It never really was an electoral list decision for us. We never took points in the polls because we were talking about the housing crisis. It's never been a popular subject. Yet we've been constant on that issue, and right now, maybe for the first time in 15 years, the housing crisis is at the top of the list in political priorities. It's now at the center of the public conversation in Quebec and in Canada. And I think that coherence across time, across the years, will pay some time. But we don't do politics in a way by, choosing a specific clientele. We do politics for our values, for the project we have for Quebec, and the housing crisis is a good example of an issue that was a priority for us for years. Now I think we are beginning to get credit for the work we did on that issue for years under the radar.
I think this decision by the CAQ to give close to $1 billion for the Olympic Stadium, the housing crisis might come into clearer focus. A lot of people are saying now, what is going on. Wouldn't this money be better spent? There's no way, first of all, to justify that kind of money for a stadium that doesn't have a future, doesn't seem to. And why not put that kind of money into the housing situation?
It's a good question, and it's a tough decision to make for governments, because the Olympic Stadium still is an icon of Montreal, of Quebec. It's an important icon for Eastern Montreal in general. And what the government is telling us and telling Quebec is that it's going to cost more to demolish it than to renovate it. So is it the best decision that was taken? I don't know. But it looks to me as the worse decision.
Yeah.
All right. Let me
And
ask-
sometimes you have to do those kind of decisions.
Let me ask about a general question, if I
Yeah.
can. So I mentioned Paul St. Pierre Plamondon had been here
Yeah.
a week or so ago. There are two independence parties here.
Yep.
One is Quebec Solidaire,
Yeah.
one is the Parti Québécois. How are you different from them?
In a lot of ways. I think our project is different. We want to build a new Quebec. We want to have a new constitution for Quebec. And we think that that country has to be founded on first of all, a reconciliation pact with First Nations that were there long before Anglophones and Francophones. That has been at the core of our project, of our constitutional project since our foundation. We are against Bill 21. We think the building
Did
of
you just
that.
say you're against Bill 21?
Yeah, of course.
You're against, but not against the use of the notwithstanding clause to keep it in place?
Yes.
What we think is that that debate has to be solved in Quebec, and that debate has to be, in French we say tranché. It has to be decided by Quebec institutions. And Quebec has a charter of rights and freedom. That charter was adopted with the unanimity of the National Assembly years before the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So that's why we're asking since the beginning of that debate that Bill 21 should be subjected to the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedom. The government has decided to invoke the derogatory clause for that charter also. That means, I think, that they know their own law is in contradiction with the Quebec Charters of Rights and Freedoms. So we are asking for Bill 21 to be subjected to that charter, and we are asking for that derogatory clause to be suspended in order for Quebec courts to examine the constitutionality of Bill 21.
Which is happening now. You have an appeals
Yep.
court waiting, everyone
Yep,
waiting for a
it's,
decision.
in the upcoming weeks, yes.
What happens when that decision comes back and says, no, we don't support the renewal, the use of the notwithstanding clause to enforce Bill 21?
Our position is already to say that the Quebec derogatory clause should not be imposed on Bill 21.
I have a question, and
Yeah.
it's a little related to Aaron's question, because that was my original question, but Aaron stole my question.
I'm so sorry.
I've got a new question. Because the CAQ has such a super
Yep.
majority, would it be in the interest of the PQ and your party to perhaps merge? Because you're going to have to, so you were saying what's different about your two parties, but do you have enough in common, including wanting to sovereignty? Do you have enough in common to merge, to perhaps really be able to beat this party, which takes up a lot of space right now?
Well, the future will say, but there is no discussions about that. There is no plan about that. And we have not only, I think our differences are not a matter of details. Let's take the issue of immigration. Mr. Plamondon has been doing a mediatic tour of Quebec, saying that the main cause of the housing crisis is immigration. That is, for us, irresponsible and unacceptable. The housing crisis has been preparing itself for at least a decade in Quebec. The very recent explosion of temporary immigration in Quebec, that has started 2 years ago. the underfunding of social housing has started in the 90s, first from the federal government that has retracted its funds, and then continued under the Liberal and CAQ governments. So the roots of the housing crisis we are witnessing today come from a long time before the very recent and problematic explosion of temporary immigration in Quebec. It's not a matter of detail. When you say that the main social crisis right now in Quebec, which is, I think, the housing crisis, when you say that the cause of that is immigration, well, I think you're doing a factual mistake first, and I think it's a problem, and we will not follow Mr. Plamondon in that direction.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Deli, serving Montrealers since 1946 and home of the city's best smoked meat sandwich, the Snowden Deli, DeCarry Boulevard, north of Queen Mary Road. What is your plan then for immigration? He's talking about a number of 35,000. I think that's the number we heard. Do you have a number, a plan?
First of all, it's a problem that we talk about that only in terms of numbers.
Okay.
Because the problem is the system itself, and the system is broken. It has been broken by Mr. Legault and Mr. Trudeau together. What happened in the last years in Quebec is very simple. Mr. Legault promised that he would lower the level of permanent immigration in Quebec. What he didn't tell us is that on the side, he launched an historic, unprecedented rise of temporary, precarious immigration. And that has resulted in the scandals we have seen in the newspapers, in the media, of temporary workers being sometimes exploited by their employers. So the premise of that debate has to be what kind of immigration do we want, not what number do we want. Of course, numbers matter. But the first question is, what model do we want? Do we want a precarious and temporary immigration that is bad for immigrants themselves because they are tied to one employer only? Or do we want a regionalized immigration with good support all across Quebec on a permanent basis? Businesses are not a fan of that temporary, precarious immigration. What they want to have is employees that are established on a permanent basis in their regions, in their communities. Quebecers also, I think, want that. So that's why our position is a nuanced and pragmatic one, to say, of course, we cannot continue in the direction of having 500,000 temporary people going from a precarious status to another, sometimes not for 6 months, sometimes for 10 years on a temporary status, while having an artificial level of permanent immigration of 50,000 or even worse, 35,000 like Mr. Plamondon is putting forward. So we need to do both of those things. We need to lower the level of temporary immigration because it's a bad model for immigrants and for the economy and for Quebec. And at the same time, we have to raise the level of permanent immigration to be able to integrate people correctly in the Quebec
And
system.
I'm guessing you would want control entirely provincially without
Of
the
course,
federal
that should be
government.
controlled by the government of Quebec. Quebec has a long history, a long tradition of being a safe haven for people across the world fleeing persecution, wars, and climate change. More and more, it is the next challenge. The politicians are all getting panicked because we have a few tens of thousands of people coming in. With climate change, we are going to be facing hundreds of thousands of climate refugees.
Right.
So we need to start that debate on factual and good faith basis.
Don't we also want immigrants who want to stay in Quebec instead of just using Quebec as a stepping stone to then leave for Toronto or because the
Yes,
numbers are quite...
and we have to also we have to realize the fact that a lot of flights come in at the airport of Montreal Airport, and they ask for asylum in Quebec just because it's the place where
you
their
can.
flights come
Right,
in.
where they went,
So that's why it's not a problem to say let's work all the provinces together with the federal government to have a fair repartition of those asylum seekers across Canada, because a lot of people come here because they speak French, they want to come into Quebec society, that's good. But a lot of people ask asylum here just because it's where their flight come in. A lot of those people would be totally voluntarily would raise their hand to say, yes, I want to go into Vancouver.
But how do you feel about Anglophone immigrants? Because this is a situation where I know actually some people who are Anglophone and who would like to immigrate here, but they're worried about, that it's not going to be easy for them because they're not coming from a Francophone culture or country.
Well, I think there is a pretty strong consensus in Quebec that it's normal for us to, when it comes to economic immigration, making sure that a good proportion of those immigrants speak French. But when you talk about humanitarian immigration, which is asylum seekers, but also
Refugees.
in French we say regroupement familial,
Right.
which is another
Family.
category, family reunion,
Yes.
another category of humanitarian immigration. When you talk about those people, we need to welcome them because we have international obligations as a state, and eventually as a country we would have exactly the same international obligations according to the Geneva Convention to welcome people that are fleeing wars, persecution, or catastrophes. So we need to accompany those people in the process of learning French.
Right.
That takes a long time, but it is possible if you give resources to people. And if we need to pay people to have French courses while they work in their restaurants or in the shops, well, then we should do it.
Right.
Each money we spend on giving resources for immigrants to learn French is a well-spent dollar.
Right, but on that subject, we're looking at what's happening with the universities, and
Yep.
they're announcing that the enrollments are down because of this requirement, perhaps because of the money, but also because of this requirement for French
Yep.
courses. So what was been your reaction to that? Because that's a big topic, I'm
Yeah.
sure, for people who are watching
Yeah.
the podcast.
Well, it's a bad solution. It's a bad solution to a real problem. Because let's be honest here. In Quebec, we should agree that whether it's a French or an Anglophone campus, education is a public service. Universities in Quebec are public. They are funded in majority by public funds. The tuition fees are capped because of that by the government. And there we should agree on the fact that there needs to be an equity between those universities. I don't want to live in a Quebec where there are two classes of universities, and that has nothing to do with a linguistic issue.
You're talking about
It's a-
funding now.
Yeah, it's a public service issue, and it's an issue of, do we want a private system of universities when we have very rich universities and very poor universities, or we want to have a fair system where everyone is funded equally and where education, post-secondary education, is viewed as a public good. I think that's what we need to do. And the government is saying, because McGill and Concordia are doing a lot of money with outside of Quebec students, then, and that's true, and that's a problem, their solution is to raise the fees. That's not the good solution. What we need to do is to review the way we fund our universities to still be able to welcome students from outside Quebec, asking them a reasonable tuition fee, while still fighting to make sure that that money that comes into Quebec is distributed equally between the universities, because we need to have strong universities not only in Montreal but across Quebec and other regions. So that's why I say the decision of the CAC is a bad solution to a real problem.
What
Yeah,
is that
yeah.
solution, though? If you're looking for more money for French universities, where does that money have to come from? Should it be on the back of students coming from
I
other
think there
provinces
should
in
be a
Canada?
red distribution system inside, between the universities themselves, to make sure that if some universities enrich themselves because of their prestige or because of their
That they should share
reputation,
with the
they
others.
should share that. Universities in Quebec are not a private business.
Okay.
They are a public good, and they should be managed that way.
Fair enough, and your arguments make perfect sense, but you will recall that this whole decision came out of Mr. Legault losing a riding in Quebec City, and all of a sudden came up with this idea that the raison d'etre for all of this was too much English being spoken downtown. And yes, the funding and everything else, but that came about later. They had no statistics to prove that one way or another, and certainly in the summertime here, there is a lot of English being spoken. It's tourism.
I don't know if there's a link between the Jean Talon by-election and that decision, but let's go to the root of that decision. Who decided to completely deregulate the tuition fees asked for international students in Quebec? Who was the government that put that policy in place in the first time? The Liberal Party. So right now, there are, in French we say, déchirer notre chemise.
You're ripping off your shirts.
They're ripping off their shirt. But the Liberals were the ones who started that problem. They were the ones that said there is no cap now for tuition fees for international students.
Okay.
So when I see Madame Risky or all those Liberals MNAs trying to be the saviors, it's quite funny because they were the one in the first place who started that bad policy. And now the CAQ is trying to find a solution to that, and it's a bad one. But the one that broke the system is the Liberal Party of Quebec.
To Bill's point, though, that statement which Jean-François Roberge, I think, actually said, he's hearing too much French downtown. But what was your reaction when you heard that?
It has nothing, for me, it has nothing to do with a linguistic issue. It's a matter of having a good policy for higher education in Quebec. If people, because you have to choose your argument. If your argument is that people come here to have a diploma at McGill and then they leave, and it's not fair, then they're not a problem for French on the long term because they leave. So if you have that argument, you have that argument. And if you have the argument that having international students is bad for French, then don't say that they leave. So the arguments of the government itself is completely contradictory.
Okay. I would just, one other thing that I wanted to bring up, and I saw the number again. I remember asking Mr. Plamondon, support for sovereignty has been pretty much consistent at around 35% in that area. We found that in the Léger poll that came out a few days ago, that of the people who now say they would vote PQ, 24% of them do not favor independence. How do you square that circle? People would vote for Quebec Solidaire, who perhaps like you, like the party's platforms, policies, but don't like the idea of separation. What do you do?
Well, I will let Mr. Plamondon answer for his numbers.
Okay.
But the portrait you're painting is not new for Quebec Solidaire. We always had a good portion of our electorate that is not completely 100% convinced that independence is the good thing. And you can see the glass half empty or half full. If you see it half empty, you say, "Oh, it's a weakness." I think it's a strength because that means that those people still vote for us, even if they know we are for independence. That means that they're listening to us. That means that they're open to our way of talking about that project. We want Verdun. We want Saint-Henri-Saint-Anne. That means there are Anglophones in Quebec, progressive Anglophones, that want a progressive party to go forward, and they can live with the fact that that party is for independence. Because I don't believe that electors don't know what they're voting for. I believe in the intelligence of electors, and I think those electors vote for us while fully knowing we are for independence. That means our way of talking about it opens a possibility for them to support that project.
To convince them?
It's a long road. It's a long process.
Would you hold
but
a
I see it
referendum
as
in your
strength.
first...
Those people, I think, would not vote for the Parti Québécois. That means that's what we add to that debate. We have a way of opening the project to new people. We are the first party for the younger generation. Still, we are a party for independence. Is that a strength or a weakness? I think it's a I think it's a strength. I think it's the proof that the way we talk about it opens up people to that idea.
Okay. Mr. Plamondon said he would hold a referendum on his first mandate.
Although he seems to be waffling on that, I think, a little bit lately. So.
Not the last time he was here, but nonetheless, what about you?
Yeah. We have a different way of walking towards independence. We think it should be a very democratic decision. And we think that, the traditional way of talking about independence in Quebec has been, it's yes or no. And then after the yes or no, we'll see what we do with, we'll figure out what we do with First Nations. We'll figure out. What about the rights of linguistic minorities in Quebec? We'll figure out. Trust us. That means sign us a blank check. Trust us, it will all be okay. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people have been hesitating. We're saying let's do the opposite. Let's write first the Constitution of Quebec, where all those rights will be protected, and then on the basis of that concrete constitutions, where the rights and freedoms of everybody will be fully guaranteed, where the First Nations will be fully recognized as equals of the Quebec nation. On the basis of that project, let's ask people to make a decision. So it's really a reversal of the traditional way of talking about independence.
I would just ask, as I hear you say that, theoretically, you win an election tomorrow.
We start
you go ahead and do this. It could take years for you to reach that.
It could take years. It's going to take the time it needs to take.
Okay.
But we're going to start in the first mandate that democratic process of writing a new constitution for Quebec in order to make the project as inclusive and as democratic as possible.
Okay.
I want to ask a question about language because just yesterday there was a very funny viral video that went around with Mr. Legault saying he thinks it's sad that young people are throwing in English words, and then it was funny because he said cool.
They find it cool.
Cool. He used the word himself. But I didn't find it so funny that he's always degrading English is the enemy for him in Quebec. I can completely understand about saving the language, about preserving the language. And yet, as the Anglophone community, I think we're starting to feel, especially in Montreal, because Montreal is our city. You're from Montreal yourself. As people who are bilingual, trying to live in both languages even, we're starting to feel, it's been a while now, but we're starting to feel that, especially Mr. Legault, this kind of Anglophobia or I just was wondering how Quebec Solidaire approaches this issue, which is a massive issue because this is still a very bilingual city, and yet we're starting to feel like it's not enough. There are people who say there shouldn't be English spoken in the streets of Montreal. How do you feel about that?
I think you're giving a good example. I think it's the worst way of convincing people that French is important. It's a counterproductive way to defend French in Quebec. First of all, because you're pointing the finger at young people, telling them
what to do,
how to speak, and you're actually saying that it's a real problem that young people are saying cool.
Right.
I mean, first of all, it's completely superficial. I mean, young people have always had their own vocabulary, their own slang.
Yeah.
It's been like that forever, and it's so old as a way of thinking to say that we're gonna moralize young people for the way they speak. Yeah. You think this is gonna convince young people that French is important? Yeah. No, it's gonna convince them
to keep
the opposite.
Using words.
It's gonna convince them that speaking French and having a good French and thinking about the future of French in Quebec, they're going to associate that fight with that comment. Yeah, okay. And they're going to say, it's in French, we say ringard.
Yeah.
So if in French, I would say that Mr. Legault ringardise le combat pour le français. So he makes it out of fashion.
Uncool.
Uncool. He makes it uncool.
Yeah.
And we should be doing the opposite. We should be celebrating French, and of course, we should be.
It's cool to be bilingual,
and we should be emphasizing the fact that there is a very cool and actual and young French culture in Quebec, and sometimes that French has touches of Creole, because there are Haitian young people speaking French and doing French podcasts with Creole in it, and sometimes a word of English, and that's the real French spoken by the real francophones, young francophones of Quebec.
And Paris too, in France.
And a language is not a museum object.
Is it an insecurity? Is it because the French don't seem to have that same insecurity?
I don't know. I'm not in the mind of Mr. Legault. I don't know. But what I know is that the effect that does comment as, and I think Aaron had a great way of saying it in English, it's making it uncool. And it's counterproductive.
You know, it's
By the
very
way, I
interesting.
just want to clarify, you're not going to have a slogan at any point to Leslie's idea of it's cool to be bilingual, are you?
Well, I think I don't know if I qualify as a bilingual.
You
but I
are,
think
of course.
It's a strength as a citizen, as a worker, as a young or an old people, whatever. I think it's a strength as an individual
Right,
to be
right.
bilingual. I think we all agree that French in Quebec will always be fragile, just from a geopolitical point of view. Just like other language around the world are being threatened by this bulldozer of American culture that is
Yep.
running across the world.
Yeah.
And most Anglos here don't dispute that either. That French is
I don't.
Yeah.
I think Anglos don't dispute that.
No, not
And
at
I
all.
think-
We love the French language, but
it would Quebec be a better place in North America without French?
no.
No, and
No.
I never.
Otherwise, we
I
would
never
move-
met an Anglophone saying Quebec would
Yeah.
be nice without French.
You know, it's very
Quebec
interesting.
Anglophones have,
Yeah.
they've been raised here. They live here.
Yeah.
They know that French is a part of what we are, and
Absolutely.
a
Yes.
big part of what we are. They just, I think, they want to have their place in that project.
Leslie asked you a question, what differentiates you from
Yeah.
the PQ? Well, it's very easy when you talk to you. You are much more, you're from Montreal. Your party is very much like focused to municipal issues more than the other parties, it's fair to say. And I mean, your politics are certainly radically different from the PQ. And I'm just wondering, like, you understand the city. And I think that maybe that message is sometimes lost because there's a huge population, Anglo-Franco, everybody
Right.
there that would like to hear your thoughts on these subjects
Well,
more.
I've been doing this for
Many years.
many years now, even if I'm still young, and I think we are a party that can bring people together. I think we are able to talk to the people of Montreal. We also are able, and we have to be better in talking to people outside of Montreal.
Right.
And I think that's what Quebec needs is a project where everyone is a part of. And we were talking about the housing crisis. I mean, whether you speak French, English, if you've been here for 10 generations or half a generation, the housing crisis is threatening everyone. This is a fight that can unite people. It can unite people inside Montreal because Anglophones and Francophones are challenged by the housing crisis, but it can also unite people outside of Montreal. I mean, the lowest inoccupation rates in Quebec are outside of Montreal. The housing crisis is in fact hitting harder outside of Montreal than inside of Montreal.
Right,
So
right.
that's
But Montreal
it's
is-
an example of a fight
I
that
just-
can
Yeah.
unite people.
I want to say one thing
Yeah.
to you. Every time I've spoken to you in the past, at the end of an interview, people will call and say, you know what, I really like that guy. If only he wasn't in favor of separation,
Yeah.
I would vote for him.
No one is perfect.
There you
My
go.
kids voted for him, right? My kids voted for him.
So did mine.
I think that if we keep talking about that project in the way we are thinking about it, I wouldn't be in politics if I thought it was impossible to unite
Sure.
people. I think it's possible. We have, for example, my colleague Manon has done an unbelievable job in the last years trying to build a dialogue with First Nations about how can we together imagine a new constitutional pact where the 12 nations that are sharing the Quebec territory, so the Quebec nation and the 11 First Nations, how can we, as 12 nations, build a new thing together? I think that's what we need to do.
I know, Leslie, we have to wrap up. You wanted to ask, this is an important thing that doesn't
Yep.
get talked about a lot, so please.
I really want so about I think it was in December.
Yes.
We got together. I met Mr. Nadeau-Dubois with several other chefs and
Yes.
cookbook authors, and he has an amazing project that I want him to talk about because I
Yes.
believe next week the video is being launched.
Yes.
and I think it's just amazing.
The corner booth has the
The
as the
exclusive,
scoop. Yeah.
right.
So we have a big problem in Quebec. Everyone knows it. Well, I think everyone knows it. Everyone should know it. 1 Quebecers out of 10 is in a line to go to a food bank. This is the highest of the recent history. It's a major problem. One of the reasons is the housing crisis. One of the other reason is the spike of prices at the grocery store. And the result of that is that in our schools today, a lot of children have an empty stomach. how 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 can we say, how dare we say that education is a priority in Quebec if there are students in the classrooms with their stomach empty? They will not be able to learn. I mean, it's for me, it's like it's so obvious that it should be a priority. Canada is the only country in the developed countries in the G7 without a universal school meal program. That's a shame. That's a shame. We should be making sure in our classrooms every children has eaten correctly all across the day. That's why Quebec Solidaire will be promoting in the next months, with a vast coalition of grassroots organizations, a campaign to make sure we launch in Quebec a universal school meal program. It's good for the kids. It's also cool for the families, because who likes to do like 5 lunches a week?
Right.
And that's if you have 1 children. If you have 2, it's 10 lunches a week. So it's good for the wallet of families, it's good for the children, it's also good for our economy, and it's good for our agriculture sector, because we would be asking the schools to have to buy locally
Right.
the products
Right.
that they transform to serve to children. It would cost a bit, of course, but the social and economic outcome of such a program would be much bigger
Yeah.
than the immediate cost. So we're going to be launching a very special project that Leslie had
Right.
the kindness
Project.
to participate in. It's going to be launched next week, and you're going to hear Quebec Solidaire challenging Mr. Legault on that issue in the next weeks, in the next months, because it is not acceptable. We are in a rich society.
Right.
We are in a rich society.
Yeah.
How can we accept
Right.
kids with an empty stomach in our public schools?
Right.
It's unbelievable.
And nutrition even is very important, because it then feeds into the healthcare system, and it feeds into so many systems after that.
If we would have the mean to calculate on a 50-year basis, how much money do we save when we make sure that kids eat correctly in their school? How much money do we save in education?
Right.
How much money do we save in social services? How much money do we save in healthcare costs? Because kids 5 or 10 times a week will have eaten a good meal prepared for them in their school.
Right. This is an
I
initiative
think
too
the
that
number would be like
Yeah.
astronomical.
in England, Jamie Oliver has been all over this for the past
Yeah.
decade. In France,
Yeah.
they eat very well in schools. It's not about eating; it's just eating basically. Yeah.
Yes, and it's good for the agriculture sector, because we know it's a challenge for Quebec to make sure we keep a good agriculture sector all across our regions. One of the things we can do to help them is not only giving them money, is to make sure there is a demand for their products.
Yeah.
If the public sector gives the example and buys locally, it creates a demand
Right.
for our agricultures.
Absolutely.
We are
Look what's
at a
happening in
time.
France.
Thank you so
Yeah, yeah.
want to thank you so much for being
It's
with
been
us
a pleasure.
today.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Stone Deli. Don't forget to take home your smoked meat sandwich.
I will, and I think I will come back. I'm a big smoked meat guy,
Yep.
so I'm going to
Okay.
try it, and I think I'll come back.
We look forward to having you back. Thank you so
It's
much
been
for
a
your
pleasure.
time
so
today.
much.
Thank you for coming.
That wraps up another edition of the Corner Booth here at the Stone Deli. We'll see you again soon.